Sweet. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We are in session 2 of the Salesforce Flow learning series. We had an amazing first session. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for that. And thanks a bunch to William and Olivia for helping us with these series. And thanks for the amazing first session, and looking forward for the upcoming sessions. So a huge thank you for everyone who've taken time to join us today across the globe. I know we just don't have people from Toronto, we have it from all over the world, and thank you so much for joining us. All right, most of you already are familiar with William and Olivia. I just want to take a few minutes to quickly introduce our incredible speakers today. So William is an experienced Salesforce practitioner. He has 12 Salesforce certifications, and over the last 4 years, he has worked on and led several successful Salesforce implementations across multiple cloud and across various industries. He currently works at Slalom Canada, and he is a senior Salesforce consultant. Thank you, William, again. And moving on to Olivier. Olivier is again from Montreal, and he transitioned from manufacturing industry into Salesforce. He has spent last 3.5 years in the Salesforce ecosystem, and he has 11 Salesforce certification. And he enjoys discovering new features and solving complex problems using everything that he has in his toolbox. And he currently also works at Slalom Canada as a consultant in the Salesforce practice. Here are your group leaders. You already know Prashant, myself, and Neil. These are our LinkedIn and Twitter handles. If you'd like to connect with us, please feel free to. And I'm also going to drop in the group link as well as the chatter link here. So this is where we post all the Toronto admin community group updates. Anything about the upcoming events, the recordings, and everything goes in here. So please follow us in these places. Our sponsor host for today's event, our Zoom sponsor is Slalom. So thank you so much, Slalom team, for sponsoring us and helping us with the Zoom for this entire series. Moving on to today's agenda, we are right now doing the kickoff, and then we're going to take a deep dive into record triggered flows today. William and Olivier will help us through that. And then around 6:30, we'll have a quick Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put it in the chat. Most likely we will answer it through the sessions. If not, we will address it at the end. And we also have a lucky draw at the end, and we're going to give away 2 Salesforce certification vouchers. So ensure that you stay till end so that your name gets picked up. If we call out the name and you're not in the call, you might miss out your voucher. So please stay in till the end for us. All right, a little bit of housekeeping rules for our virtual meeting today. Turn on your camera if you feel appropriate. Mute your mic so everyone can hear the presentation clearly. And post your questions in the chat window. We will pick that up at the end of the session. And be engaging, ask questions, participate, network, as we had been doing so far. We had a lot of good, healthy discussions last time. We would love to see all those discussions today as well. Last but not the least, be polite and respectful to the group. This is quick announcement on the lucky draw. Again, a reminder that you need to stay till end of the session while we do the lucky draw in order for you to get the certification voucher. We will be giving 2 vouchers away today, and it will be based on the lucky draw. And we need you to give your first name, last name, and email address once we announce the winners. All right, without much ado, let's get started. Over to you, William and Olivia.
Thanks, Sada. So, Olivier, could you share your screen?
Yes, I'm getting this. Here it is. And I'm gonna go full screen.
Nice. Cool. So you can go to the next slide.
Here it is. Okay.
Right. So quickly, we just want to reiterate, thank you to everyone attending here. We are pretty excited about that series and the sessions we are giving here. As we seen earlier, we have attendance across the globe, so that's pretty exciting. And again, just want to reiterate a big thanks to Prashant and Sudha and all the organizers for this, because I think this is really great for the community. So thanks again. So, all right, let's talk about quickly the learning series agenda, just for folks who maybe were not there last week, just to recap the purpose of that series and where we are at today. So it's a 4 weeks series in which we're going to cover flows, and we're going to cover it from the perspective of like the basics from flows. So assuming you know nothing from flows, and then building on top of that, so that at the end of those sessions, you're equipped to build flows for 80% most of the scenarios. So we had the very first session last week, which was just a general introduction on flow, what they are, what are the various elements and key items around flows. And today we are in the second session, which is record triggered flow. So we'll do kind of a deep dive on that type of flow specifically. And we'll also have some live examples that we'll share with you. Next week, we'll talk about screen flows. And in 2 weeks from now, it will be the last sessions, and we'll go a bit deeper into some of the advanced concept and best practices on flows. So if you want to go to the next slide, perfect. Thanks, Olivier. So this is the agenda for today. It's a bit different than what you shared, Prashant and Sudha. It's actually more detailed. We added more content. Don't worry, it seems packed, but some of those topics are pretty light. But we just wanted to make sure that we cover everything that is relevant to record triggered flow. So we'll cover global variables, trigger type. We'll talk about flow path, flow entry conditions. Basically, those 4 items are kind of the key items to construct a record triggered flow, which will lead to the demo where Olivier is going to do a live example and creating a flow from scratch with you. Then we'll talk about flow trigger explorer and the order of execution. And we'll have, I think, kind of a demo or an interactive demo where we show how to use it and how to navigate in the Flow Trigger Explorer. And then lastly, before the Q&A, we will have the presentation of the exercise. This is something that we thought could be useful. So we're going to describe just a quick use case and scenario at the end of the session. And if you guys have the time and want to do it, you can practice and try to take that use case and create the relevant flows to achieve that requirement and address that business need. And at the beginning of next week's session, we'll spend 5 minutes to go through the solution and share how we would think or how we would tackle that, that business requirement. All right, so without further ado, let's jump into it and let's start with global variables because before going into trigger type, we wanted to take some time to introduce global variables since we haven't had the chance to talk about it in the last session, and I think it was already pretty packed, so we kept that topic for this specific session. Because it's an important concept, and especially in the context of record trigger flow, you'll see that you'll have to use a lot what we call global variables. So in a nutshell, what are global variables? They are system provided variables that reference information about the Salesforce org or the running user, such as the user ID, the API session ID, and it can be much more. On the screenshot that you can see on the right, those are the values that you can have as global variable. And basically, if you click on those, you can go a level deeper and you can access a lot of fields related to that. So an example of global variables, to keep it simple, is user. Basically, if you access that, and all those global variables are provided by default in a flow. So you don't have to do anything. When you create a flow, you'll see that you have access to those global variables. And so, for example, the user global variable, what it is, it's basically information provided on the user who's running the flow. So if you would click on that user global variable, you would be able to access any fields, any attributes on the user who's running the flow, such as what is the name of that person, what is the email address associated with that user. Along the same vein, you have the profile information. If, for example, you want to drive different behavior on your flow based on the profile associated to the user running the flow, then you have the profile global variable that can be accessed with all the relevant fields. Now, in the context of a record triggered flow, because this is what we're here to talk about today, there are 2 additional global variables that are really important. Those are record and record prior. So basically record, this is the variable that contains the triggering records value. So if you click on that opportunity record that we'd have on the screen, you'd be able to access any field values on the opportunity that triggered the flow. The record prior is similar. It's just that it allows you to access the value that the triggering record had before the flow started and before the update was done. So an example of that is, let's say I go to an opportunity and I change the amount from 1,000 to, let's say, 3,000. What I would have under record is 3,000 because this is the new value. And what I would have under record prior amount is 1,000 because this is the value prior to doing the change. When the flow is triggered for a newly created record, because we'll see that later, you can define when you create a record triggered flow, the event or the timing at which you want your flow to be triggered. If you define a flow for a newly created record, so on insert or on record creation, you won't have any record prior values. And that makes sense because the record is new. There was no values in any fields prior to the creation of the record. A use case, just to be visual and explain, a use case on how you could leverage record prior is, for example, let's say on an opportunity, you want to calculate the difference in terms of percentage on the amount. So let's say you want to trigger a specific behavior when the amount has been changed for more than 30%. To do that, you'd need the amount that was set prior and the new amount to be able to do the calculation. So that's an example of how record prior can be used. There are obviously like a ton of other example and use case that can be useful for record prior. And then lastly, in the slide, we have included a hyperlink. You'll get access to the slide that details more what are global variables and what each type of global variables can contain as information. If you want to deep dive into, like, let's say, organization profile, you have the reference here for you. So now let's talk about record triggered flow type. So this is just a reminder. If you attended last week's session, you should already be aware of what this is. Basically, as you know, we have different type of flows in Salesforce. And one of them is record triggered flow, which is what we're going to talk about today. So a record triggered flow, this is basically a flow that is used to execute an action when a record is modified, created, or even deleted. So this is basically to set up some automation on specific event that you do on records. This tool is the tool that is going to replace at some point process builder and workflow rules, which, as we've seen last week, are going to be decommissioned. So record triggered flow, if you were used to process builder or workflow rules, this is the thing that you should be used to, and this is the thing that you should be close to. So use case is for like every opportunity created over, let's say, 5,000, you want to trigger some action, notify manager, edit some fields, anything like that. So before going into trigger and what it means and what are the options we have, we thought that it was important to introduce some database terminology to make sure that we understand the intricacies of each trigger type, and we'd say even more just trigger as a whole. And you're probably wondering, what is trigger? We'll cover that in a sec. If you are familiar with some development, have been close to developers, you might have heard trigger, and it's going to be important for you to know what this is. So before even talking about the first term that we're seeing here, let's talk about what is a database and how to visualize a database. A database is basically, you can picture this as kind of a container or a table in which we would have values or rows if we think about tables. And more specifically, if we think about the context of Salesforce, we would think about within that database, we would have records. So let's say if we look at UC database and more specifically at the contacts table, in that we're technically supposed to have all the contacts that are in the org right now, or we're basically supposed to have in that table rows for every contact records that exist in the system. And what's important to know as well is that in that database, technically this reflects the records and the values that everyone is seeing. So let's say that two persons are looking at the same contact in Salesforce. They're basically looking at the same values in the database for that record, for that rows. Now that leads me to how can we change those values or that record in the database. That leads to the term commit. So basically, a commit is the update of a record in the database. Or put it differently, it's basically the saving of data permanently, which make all the changes visible to other users. So basically, when you're editing a record and you're clicking on save, you're committing a change to the database. And that's what we try to illustrate here in the small diagram, is that the database is in a state before you do the change. So let's say that the UC contacts database is in state 1. We have not done anything yet, and there's only one contact, which is John Doe. I create a new contact, which is going to lead to a commit. It's going to do a commit. After that commit is done, the database is going to be in a new state, which is state 2. And now we have 2 records in the database, which is John Doe and Sam Smith. And everyone that is looking at that same database is now going to see 2 records. So now rollback. Rollback is basically the opposite thing. It's basically discarding a change that was done as part of a transaction. So a rollback will return the database to some previous state. So if we take the same example, let's say that we created a new contact, which we added Sam Smith. We're going to roll back that transaction. We're going to go back to the state 1 where Sam Smith was not part of the database. And so if we do a rollback, we're basically back to state 1 where John Doe is the only one in the database. If we go to the next slide, that leads to DML. So what is DML? DML stands for data manipulation language. This is basically a way for providing a straightforward way to manage records by providing really simple statements to commit the changes in the database. So you have different type of statements. You have insert, update, upsert, delete, undelete, and merge. Insert is basically create a record. If you think about it on a flow perspective, it's create records. And if you recall, last week we saw the data elements that we had that Olivier introduced. Create records is I want to create something new. This is the equivalent of the insert statement. Update, pretty straightforward. It's the update record. Upsert, it's a bit more advanced. It's not something that is available in flows. It's a mix of both. At the same time, you're doing an insert and an update. But you don't need to care about that because in flows, it's not applicable. Not yet. Maybe it will be at some point, but not for now. Delete, pretty straightforward, the ability to delete records, and the equivalent is the delete element. And then undelete and merge, those are statements that are available in Apex coding, not in Salesforce. So you don't need to worry about those, but just to know that there are those other statements that, that exist. Something that is important to mention, and we'll reemphasize that in the last session, but every time you're doing a DML statement, every time you're using one of those elements that you're seeing on the screen, create record, update record, delete record, that is using some performance, that is impacting the performance of your flow and your automation, because you're basically doing a DML operation and committing something. So it's really important to be cautious as you're using those elements, those DML statements, and as much as possible, when you're doing a DML operation, when you're using one of those elements, try to doing in bulk. What we mean by bulk is doing an update for a collection. Again, if you recall to last week's session, we saw what a variable is, right? It's kind of a container that contains a value of a specific type. And a collection is basically the same thing, but that can contain multiple values. So with Flow, and you'll see that, I think, later in the demo, when you're doing create record, update record, or delete record, you can basically pass multiple records to update, create, or delete at the same time. You don't have to do them one by one. And actually, our recommendation is, as much as possible, try to always update in bulk, because this is much more performant. So that's why here we've really highlighted it. And again, we'll put the emphasis on that in the best practice session, because this is really going to drive your performance. Then if we talk about query, so what is a query? A query is basically a way to access or view record or data that you have in your database. So this is basically a request to say, hey, can I retrieve information from the database? Query, they can have filters or criteria to retrieve only a specific set of records that match those conditions. So you can define specific conditions to make sure that you're not retrieving all records, but just specific subset of records. And similar to what we saw previously for the DML statements, the counterpart in Flow for query, again, query is the, I would say, developer term that maybe you've been used to or you've heard at some point. In Flow, the equivalent is get record element. It's basically a way to be able to get some records and to get them based on specific conditions. So if we look at the example, a query can be pretty simple. It can be, can you give me all the contacts where the first name is John? What is going to happen is that it's going to look at the database. It's going to parse through all the records and see, okay, what are the records that have the first name with John? And then it's going to send me a result. And the result can be one element, or it can be multiple elements. It can be a collection. And actually, it will always be a collection. And even if you have one element, it will be a collection with that one element. And in that scenario here, we would have two results, John Doe and John Wick. Just an important note, query, again, similar to the DML statement, they can impact the performance, especially if you have a high volume of records in your instance. So again, and we'll put that to reemphasize during the best practice session, but ideally, each query or each get that you're doing in a flow should always be selective, should always have filters to be able to retrieve only the results that you need. Because the more result the query will return, the more time it will take and the less performant it will be. So that's really important. And if you can just go back, Olivier, an example is if you are using, for example, a record that for which you have the ID, try to query using that ID, because as we know, an ID is unique, right? And so if you query using an ID, you're going to only have one result, which is the record with that ID. So that's a best practice to always try to have the less result as much as possible. Okay, you can go to the next slide. All right, so now we are in trigger and trigger type. So what is a trigger? A trigger is basically a way to enable you to perform custom actions before or after changes to Salesforce records, such as insertion, updates, or deletions. This is the definition of an Apex trigger. So that's why I've crossed this out, because this is the same thing, and this is the same definition in a flow. And I thought it was important to mention that because last week I mentioned that flow is really there to bridge the gap between admins and devs. And so this is a pretty good example, because before the record triggered flow, before flows, that the ability to specify when actions are going to be performed was only available to developers within the trigger tool. Now we have access to that within the flow framework and with record triggered flow, which is a pretty big enhancement. And you'll see why later. There are two types of trigger: before triggers and after triggers. So before triggers, the equivalent in flow is before save, and after triggers, the equivalent is after save. So if you, a visualized way of seeing this is when you hit record or when you hit save on a record, what's going to happen is that you're going to have, before the change is committed to the database, you can have some automation triggered. And the impact of that is going to be much more performant. And we'll see that in the next slide. Then the change is going to be committed to the database. So the database is going to be in the new state. And then we're going to have, once the change is committed to the database, the after save flow, which can trigger different things after the record has been committed. So next slide, Olivier. So when should you use before save flow, and why should you use it? So the way Salesforce has labeled it, fast field update, it's for a specific reason. It's that when you use that, it's much more performant than an after save flow. And again, before the flow, we didn't have control over that. So when you were doing a workflow rule or a process builder, it was always after trigger, which sometimes were making your automation not that performant. So this is the go-to option when really you need to update fields on the record that triggers the flow. So let's say you're on an opportunity, and when the opportunity is saved, you want to update some information on the opportunity and just do that. This type of flow is perfect because you're going to have a good performance. However, with this, you're going to have different limits that sometimes you're going to be like, I cannot use this type of flows. If, for example, you want to perform update outside of the record. So let's say you want to update the account associated to the opportunity, or you want to create a task, or you want to delete any other record. Well, you won't be able to do that in that before save flows, and you'll have to use the other type of flows. In that type of flows, you cannot use interactions elements. So you cannot call subflow, you cannot send email. So there's basically a bunch of things that you cannot do. And really the main use case for using that is to be able to update field on the triggering record and in an efficient manner. And you cannot use schedule path in that context, and we'll see later what is schedule path. Let me see what that last note is about. Yeah, when you use a before save flow, and that's a bit more technical, but basically you're changing the way you can change the record values before they're committed to the database. You have two ways. Either you use the provided update record that will be called update triggering record. That's one way of doing it. Or you can use the assignment to use the global variables that we saw previously and say, in my global variables, the amount field is now going to be 2000. And now when the record is going to be committed to the database, this is the value. So basically all of that to say that in a before save flow, you're not, you don't have to recommit the change. You don't have to do another DML statement. After save flows, so less performant, but it allows you to do more. So this is the go-to option if you want to create, update, delete, or any other record other than the one who triggers the flow. So again, like create a task, update all, let's say you're on an account and your flow is triggered by the account changes. If you want to update all the contacts, we're not touching the triggering record, we're touching other records, then you'll have to do after save flows. Or if you want to send emails, for example, you'll have to go with after save flows as well. So the limits with after save flows, they cannot be triggered on delete event. So every time you're going to try to build a flow on delete event, it will be by default before save flow. You won't have the option to select after save flow. And the second limit is that you cannot call a subflow that has a pause element, and that's just FYI, in an after save flow. And then a couple of notes, unlike the previous one, on an after save flow, because again, the change has been committed to the database, you'll need to use the update records, and you're going to need to issue another DML statement by using that update records to update the record in the database. And again, as I pointed out previously, process builder and workflow rules were after save. So how do I select the trigger type in a flow? I'm not going to spend too much time. Olivier will show you that, but basically it's 3 parts. You need to select the object when you're configuring the start element of the flow. You need to configure the trigger. So the event, a record is created, updated, created, or updated, or a record is deleted. And then lastly, you choose the trigger type. So fast field updates, which is before, and action and related records, which is after save. So if you want to go to the next slide, Olivier. Now let's talk about path. So there are 3 types of path in Salesforce. The first one is immediate path. So immediate path is the one that you'll always have created by default. And this is basically the path that the flow will take when a record is updated and the conditions requirement are met. And Olivier will cover in a sec what the flow conditions are and the entry conditions are. But basically, this is the path that the flow will take as soon as it executes and all the conditions are met. This is all the steps that the flow will do right away. Then you can configure an async path or asynchronous path. What an asynchronous path means, and it's more advanced, so you probably don't need to worry about that, but it's more a path that will be used after the transaction. So your save has been done, and it's usually used to do calls to external systems. So to illustrate that, an example would be after you've done a save on an opportunity with a specific amount, you want to post a message to Slack, which is another system. So to do that, you're going to need to do a call to that system. And to minimize the impact on the performance, you want to do that asynchronously after you have done the save so that the user is not impacted by that. So for this, you would use an asynchronous path if the solution that you're implementing is in a flow. And then lastly, scheduled path. Scheduled path is basically the ability to trigger certain type of event based on date fields on the object that triggered the flow. So again, an example of that would be you want to create a task, and let's say 2 hours before the task due date is met, you want to trigger some behavior. You want to have some automation. Well, to do that, you can use schedule path, and we'll see in a sec how to kind of configure that. But that's a good example of a schedule path. And this is something that you should be similar with, because we have some sort of a similar functionality in Process Builder where you could configure, I think, scheduled action. And it was basically the same thing based on a date on an object. You were able to say X amount of time after that date, trigger a specific behavior. So if you go to the next slide, I'm just going to flash this here. This is just for reference for you to know which path you can use in which context, because you cannot use schedule path and async path in all types of trigger and flow. So as you can see, for example, let's say if a record is created and you have a flow that is before save, you're not going to be able to have any schedule or async path. And the thing that you see under a condition exists every time a record is updated, or only when a record is updated. Olivier will cover that in a sec to explain a bit more what this means and the implications of that. So this is just for reference in case you're wondering, why can't I see, or why can't I hide schedule or async path? You have that for reference. All right, so schedule path. So for each path with a schedule path, the way you configure it, and this is the screen that you have on the right here, you must specify a couple of things. The first thing is that you must specify the date and type field that is going to be used to calculate the start time. And so for that, this is basically the time source. When you're specifying your time source, you're basically saying which field am I going to look at and start from to calculate my scheduled action or my scheduled path. Then you have the offset number and offset options. So those offset options, they're basically specifying in which units the path will calculate, and it will also determine if it's after or before. So in that example that we have on the right here, we're going to trigger a scheduled path 10 days after the account created date. So 10 days after the account has been created. And you'll see later in the demo, in the options, we have different options. You can define minutes, hours, and it can be before or after. So it gives you flexibility in terms of what you can build. Lastly, and this is more advanced, this is under the advanced section, batch size. So this basically allows you to specify the number of records that are going to be processed at a time by this path. This is important for performance, but again, this is a bit more advanced. Just to note that if you don't specify anything, the default batch size is going to be 200. And this is more used if you want to kind of fine tune and improve the performance and avoid some technical limits. Now, so how do you add or view schedule path in a flow? So basically for schedule path, the way you would do that is you need to expand the start element by clicking on it, and then you will view that plus button with like the label saying add schedule path optional. This is optional because you can have a flow that runs only with immediate action and you don't have any schedule path. The thing to know is if the flow already has some schedule path, you will not see the same option. You will just see schedule path with the number, and then you will be able to edit. And in that edit screen, you'll be able to add new one. And one last thing is that the number, I found that it's not accurate because, for example, if you add one schedule path, you're going to see the number of schedule paths is going to say 2. But in that 2, the immediate path is actually counted for schedule path, which I think is a mistake. So it might be solved at some point. But if you see 2, actually, you'll have one schedule path plus the immediate one. So that's just a note. Async path. So I just mentioned previously what is the use of an async path. It runs after the original transaction for the triggering record. This is a bit more advanced. You'd use it for more long-running operation when you want to do like external call to other systems, or when you want to avoid specific technical errors such as mixed DML. I'm not going to go into details of that, but if you know what mixed DML, you can avoid that with async path. The thing to know, the difference, because you could think about what is the difference between async and scheduled. The thing to know is that async, you cannot define the timing at which you want to trigger it. It's going to be done automatically by the system, whereas scheduled, you define the field and the amount of time after which is going to be triggered. How to add, it's pretty easy. When you're on the configure start element, you just need to check the box, include run asynchronously option that is at the end of the screen. And by doing that, this will add the option. Just to note that based on the type of trigger, again, sometimes this checkbox will not be available. And then lastly, on flow path, how to monitor, because let's say you have some actions that are pending, how to view the list of actions that are pending execution. It's similar to what you were used before by checking the time-based workflow. You need to go at the same place and then search for your flow, and you should be able to see all the pending actions that you have. From there, you're going to be able to, if needed, manually delete an executed action by clicking on selecting the rows and deleting. And just to note that, like any other time-based workflow items that we're used to, if the conditions that trigger that flow is not met anymore, this item is going to be removed by default. So let's say our conditions was if the task is open and 2 hours before. Well, if we had a task that was open but now is closed, now the work item for this or the pending automation is going to be removed because now the task is closed. So the condition for that is not met anymore. So Olivier, over to you for flow entry.
Okay, so I'll jump in. I'll jump in the flow entry condition. We'll review what it means and what they are. Then we'll go look at the use case from that we develop, and then we'll build a flow together. And during the time I build the flow, William will monitor the chat and we'll interact together if there's any specific question. So the first step for the entry condition, it's a way to set up how we want to launch the flow. So the entry condition will allow you to pretty much say, I want to start this trigger or this flow at this moment. This is very useful when we want to have performance automation. When we want to set up those entry conditions, we have 4 options. The first option is a global end. So an example for that would be, I have an opportunity that has an amount of $5,000 and the stage is close won. If those 2 conditions happen, the flow will start. Then we have the or. For example, we want to start the flow if the status equal in review or if the status equal closed. So if any one of these state status happen, the flow will start. Then we can also implement custom logic. If we have multiple conditions, for example, we can have like the status equal in review or the status is closed and the opportunity is VIP, for example. So those 2 pair of conditions will trigger the flow. Either one of them will allow us to do this. So we can go very deep in custom logic if we have like different way to start or not start a flow, for example. Finally, it's a new thing that Salesforce developed, and I think it's the latest release that allows us to do this. It's custom formula. So now you know what all the thing you can do with the formula field in Salesforce. Well, then those formula are now available in the record trigger flow. So this gives you even more flexibility as to when you want to start your trigger. For example, this time we wanted to start the flow when the record was new or when the status was changed, for example. So this gives us like a lot of flexibility, and you'll see in the demo, I'll give you a glimpse of the custom formula editor, and it's very well designed. Then once we set up the entry condition, we now decide whenever we want to run the flow. If we have a flow on update, this will be available only if we select on update or on create an update. You won't see this section if you run your record trigger flow only on create. We have two different ways of triggering the update of the flow. The first one is every time a record is updated and meet the criteria. And the second one is only when a record is updated to meet the criteria. Most of the time, we'll prefer the second option because it's way more efficient. Because the first one, for example, if we read it, we see that every time the object has the condition. So for example, every time an opportunity is closed, for example, we will trigger the flow and it's updated. Any other field is updated, it will trigger the flow. So this can impact a lot of the performance. As for the other one, we will only trigger the flow whenever the opportunity is updated to meet the condition and won't be triggered after it. So those are the flow entry condition, and I would say the remaining part of how to design the flow after what William showed you at the beginning of the presentation. Then we'll go in our demo. So first of all, I'll go over the use case that we want to see. Then I'll show you a quick view of what the flow would look like, and then we'll build the flow together. So our use case, we start with a use case similar to what we built last week. So when an opportunity is closed won and it has an amount greater than 100,000, we want to do the following action. We want to update the related account to VIP. We want to create a task to make sure the sales rep in charge of the account takes good care of it. We want to then count all closed won opportunity related to this account. And after a week, if the task is not completed, we want to remind the rep of the task he needs to perform. So this will be done using two flows. And I'll jump in our demo org here. And we'll see that our first flow will look like this here. It's an after save flow. And our second one is also an after save, but we add only a scheduled flow here. So the first step of the demo will be to go, if I start from the beginning, you go in setup and you go in the flow section. So most of you probably used to that. We'll write flow here and we'll have access to this section in process automation flows here. This will open the list of different flows that you can see here. And you have new flow here. So we'll create our first new flow, which will be our after a save flow, and will be when we update the opportunity. So you see all the options you have here. We want a record trigger flow here. And our first step is configuring our object when we run the flow and which type of flow we are doing. So if we remember our use case, it's an opportunity. So we click here, select opportunity. Then we want to launch the flow whenever the opportunity is closed won and it has an amount of over 1,000. So we'll choose to run our flow only on update. And then we'll specify our entry condition. On this one, we'll go end. And we'll click our first condition will be amount equal 100,000. Sorry, greater than or equal here. And then we'll select the stage. So stage, you see, you have access to all the field of the opportunity available for you. Like you have the huge list of the record, and it varies by object, whatever the fields are available. So stage name, and then since the pick list, you can see that you have all the pick lists available for you. You could have written anything, but we want to see close one. And then we get to our section, when to run the flow for update record. Right now, it's scheduled at every time a record is updated and meet the condition requirement. And as we said, it's not super efficient because every time we'll have a close one opportunity and we update it, it will re-trigger the flow again and again for no reason. So we'll want to run the flow only once, or pretty much if the status change and come back to this close one status. And as we said, we'll keep it as action and related record because we want to update the account. later. And we don't want to do any async asynchronous flow. Then our first action will be to create a task. So we'll create a task here. We'll go up. We'll label it. And we can give it any name, add a description. It's usually good practice to add quick description. Task related to. We'll create one record and we'll use separate resource and literal values here. I'm gonna go with the task. And I'm gonna first set up the what ID of the task, which will be the account related to my opportunity. To do this, to have access to the account ID of my opportunity, I can use my global variable here record. And I'll write account, and you can see here I have access either to the account ID, but I can also deep dive in the account ID if I want to have pull any other value from my account. Then I'll need to add a description, and the description will need to create a text template since it is a rich field text. So we'll go here, and I went a bit quick. I'll go back here. You have access here to new resource. So whenever you don't have any variable created, you can create it from the field in the flow. So you'll click on the plus here, and as we discussed last week, we have multiple choice of variable. For this, again, since description is a long text field, we need to create a text template. We can call our variable whatever we want. So we'll call it take care of customer. And we'll just write quickly, please take care of customer. So we have our text template, and as we can see, it got added to our field here. So that's everything we need for our task here. Once the task is created, we want to update, we want to know how many how many close one opportunity we have related to this opportunity. To do this, we'll use a get record element. So get close one. This here will get opportunity as our object here. And you remember when William told you to kind of add condition whenever you were doing to get record, then we'll get all the opportunities that are related to the account ID. So we'll be able to put here account ID equals, and in our record opportunity, we'll be able to select again our account ID here. So now I'll get all the opportunity related to this account ID, and I want to get all of them that are stage equal close one. And then now I don't want to sort my record, and I want to get all the records, and I will assign them to this field here. Then we have I would say a nice thing that assignment allows to do with collection variable is to count opportunities here, and we'll have to create a variable and a number variable here. So we'll go there, call it number, and it will be a full number, so we don't want any decimal, and we'll leave it like this. And when we have a number field here, we have a new thing that's called equal counts. And you can put a collection variable here. So that's the collection variable from our account. And what the system will do, it will count the number of records there is in the collection here. And then finally, we'll update the related account. And then we'll say specify condition here. And now we were working on the opportunity. Now we'll update account because we're in after save flow. We can do this. And we'll say, I want to update the account that has an ID equal to the account ID of my opportunity. Here, so I'm going to my global variable record, and then I'm going to account ID here. And then my first update will be to check it as VIP. So VIP account is now true. And number of account, number of closing opportunity here will be our number of opportunity here. So we'll assign the number here. Honestly, this part where we count the opportunity could have been achieved with a roll up, but it was just for a demo on how we could count in number of things for any related object in a flow here. So we now have our final flow. Our last step is to save it. We'll call it flow series. Opportunity trigger. I always recommend to build a naming convention in your org. This would be our naming convention for this one. So we got our first flow done. So we go back to our setup flow here, and we'll go our last flow, which will be a fairly quick flow. This one will be again a record trigger flow, but this one will be on task creation. I'll go a bit quicker because we'll start to lack a bit of time. And since we saw here, we'll start on task creation, as I said here. We set up here, a record is created. We won't put any entry condition on this one. We'll click done, and we'll add schedule path. Our path will be reminder after 7 days. Our time source will be when the task is created. Offset number will be 7, and day after here. We don't care about the run me here. We'll just say, I want to check if my record has a status complete. Check if that is task here is not completed. And our default outcome would be the task is completed. Here we'll go with our global variable record status, and we want to say does not equal completed. And if it's not completed, we want to send an email. So we'll use our action that we spoke together about it, and we'll go use the send simple email here. This is super flexible and allows you to create quick email. So send reminder email. For our body, we'll create another text template. Here are your customer. And we'll just remind the guy, please take care of this account. So it will be done very quickly. Again, we created from there, updated. Here we'll say a subject, you're late. And then we can add an email address. So I'll put my email address here, but it could be the email address of the account, for example. Here. And this is our second flow. So this one went a bit quicker, but this is what it will look like there. And then I'll quickly jump in our condition to just go over the Flow Trigger Explorer. I'll go fairly quick. So the Flow Trigger Explorer, basically, it's a tool that got designed by Salesforce, because back in the day, well, actually, when the Flow Trigger were implemented, we had no way to manage when a trigger was executed. So for example, we know that before trigger flow will always be launch after, before and after save flow. But what if I got two before save trigger on the same object? Which one will start first? Well, with the new Flow Trigger Explorer, we'll be able to manage this. This was a problem we had with the process builder and workflow rules. So we had to put lots of, I would say, automation rule around them whenever we're creating them. With the Flow Trigger Explorer now, it's way easier. So as you can see it, you'll see it here. I got my opportunity here, and right now I see when the record is updated, and I got three sections: fast fill update, so before save, after save, and run async. So I can play with those, the flow, those two different type of flows to make it, I would say, work better and have a better control of my automation. In this one here, we have, I would say, a bit more in-depth look at it. So again, here it's what you have access to all the object in your org. Then here you have access to in your record that any types of updated, created, anything like this. In the fast fill update here, you can see your flow, but you see that it's inactive. You also have access to edit the order of the flow. That's how you'll reorganize your trigger. And you can also even create new flows from your flow trigger. In the second one, again, you'll be able to reorder them, play with them, and make sure that they trigger in the desired order. And that is quickly what the Flow Trigger Explorer allows you to do. We have a couple of minutes. I'll just show you quickly what it looks like in the org. We want to be mindful of time, so I won't spend a lot of time. You can access the Flow Trigger Explorer here. And when you click the Flow Trigger Explorer, it brings you over here. So again, when a reporting is updated, and I can click here, as we said, edit order, and that's how I can reorganize my flow. You can say, okay, I can move this one here. I want to move this one here. So I have all the flexibility of the world to have. And right now I don't want to play with anything, so I just click cancel. And when you click here, you can see the detail, the version, the status. Let's say this one has 3 versions. So if I go there, I can open each version and activate them however I want. And this was pretty quick, but this
Olivier, if you can stay on that screen, I just want to add 2 things. The first one is what you need to be careful about, because I faced that recently, is the order that you can see here. If you have not specified the order yourself, the order is not really what you see on the screen. So let's say for the flow that we can see 1, 2, 3, 4, if we have not specified the order, this is the order by default, it's not guaranteed that the order is going to be that way. And I faced that recently. So really, if you want to make sure that the order is respected, do reorder them. And another way to reorder flow and to see if they have an order value, Olivier, if you can go within a flow and go under the properties, because that's also another way. Basically, the Flow Trigger Explorer is just a shortcut to that. You have the trigger order. And the way it's going to execute it, it's going to start from the lower number to the higher. And so you can enter a number between like 0 to 2000.
2000, yeah.
The recommendation is to do high range. So go from 10 to 10, 100 to 100, just in case. Think about the future. If in the future you want to add new flows in the middle, you don't want to have to reorder all of them. So if you did from 100 to 200, you can put one in the middle. So that's another way of reordering the flows. Yeah. Really briefly, and then we'll be done. So the exercise for next week So the scenario description, you'll have the deck, you'll be able to read through that. But in order to improve prioritization of cases, the customer support manager at OW Telco has requested the case priority is automatically set based on specific business rules. So more specifically, the service manager wants cases that are assigned to VIP accounts to be flagged as high priority. So whenever a case is created or updated, we want to make sure that if it's a VIP account, the priority is high priority. And then all the other cases can be normal, except if they don't have an account link, then they should be flagged as low priority. And then in addition of that, when a case is closed, if the account associated to the case is a VIP, we want to be able to send an email to the customer, and a task should also be created 5 days after the case closure so that the case owner can do one last follow-up with the customer. So a couple of notes. We don't really care about the content of the email and the task, so you can put whatever you want in that. And the prereq is because we're basing the conditions on VIP account, you'll need a VIP flag, because I think out of the box, there's no flag to indicate if a customer is a VIP or not. So that's something you'll have to do. Yeah, and I think that's it. So we're right on time. Any questions from you guys?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Oliver and William. I think we do have some questions from the chat a while ago while William was presenting. So one of the questions was from Segal. The first question was, is it same as trigger.new and old? Segal, can you give a context to your question? You can unmute yourself.
Yes, hi. Yeah, it was regarding the I think it was the fast or the so I think it's the same, right? I think so. That's what I was asking. Is it the same as the records are available in trigger new and the old one for the prior record one?
Yeah. If you do the comparison with Apex, yes, the record and record prior, this is the equivalent to trigger.new, trigger.old. And then if you do the comparison to trigger type, so the before, like the fast field update, and the after, it's the equivalent to the before Apex trigger and the after Apex trigger.
Yeah, thank you.
No worries.
Awesome. Next question from Kevin Caputo. What is this time frame for workflow and process builder end of life?
Yeah. And I think I don't have the date. I think we said 2025. Those are like tentative date and nothing is set in stone. If you go to last week deck, you'll see we've shared a screenshot of what was shared by Salesforce in one of their live session, where you can see not only the final milestone in which they're saying they're not going to provide support anymore for workflows and process builders, but also the different milestones across the years, such as like when they're going to block new workflow rules creation, where they're going to force migration to flows and things like that. So you can find that somewhere on the net or on the presentation that we did last week.
Can I ask additional questions on that?
Mm-hmm.
So I had heard earlier on that Salesforce was going to automate the creation of replace a process builder or workflow with automatic flow. Is that true, or we have to create our own flows to replace them?
So I don't know if you've heard anything about that, Olivier. On my end, I haven't heard anything about automating. I know for now they've provided a way for make it easier to migrate from workflow rules to flows. I don't know about process builders, and that's something we wanted to cover in the last session. So we'll have to do a bit more of digging on that. So you have a way to migrate to flow, but it's not automated, I believe. It helps you.
It helps a lot. Like it's almost automated, I would say.
Yeah, but one advice that we would give as well is when you're doing that exercise, because how it's going to convert them is going to do a one-to-one. So for each workflow role, it's going to create a flow. And as much as possible, we try to have less flows and we try to consolidate them. So doing the migration is good, but if you can do the exercise of reviewing the workflow rules and seeing how you can merge those together to reduce the number of flows, because yeah, that would be the best practice.
And did I hear you correctly? Did you say 2025?
Yes, for the end of, that's what they've provided in terms of like the target date
Okay.
for end of support.
That's great. Thank you very much.
No worries.
Hi, can I ask a question that's actually specific to a flow or no?
Yes, about. proceed.
Hi, thank you. First of all, thank you for this wonderful presentation. Really helped understand the way it's working. I'm actually trying to build a flow to automate having like because I have a default account team and I want it to be where it is, just I don't have to select it because it gives me the option of adding the default team once the opportunity is changed, or adding members. So in that case, because I don't see an option for the account team, do I have to update the team members in that way? In that case, in the flow, I don't know if I'm asking a clear question.
Maybe if you can send it to us by like a quick email by percent or something like this, we could probably
Awesome.
put our
Yes.
head together and try to figure out your answer for you.
Yeah,
seems to
that's
be
awesome. That's awesome. Thank you. And you've already put your email on there. Is that the one I'm sending it on, or?
Yes. If you can send it quickly to olivier.bouchard@salam.com.
Awesome.
We'll try to see if we can answer you.
Thank you so much. Yes, I will.
Awesome, thank you. Another question from Pearly. When William was talking about trigger, was it Apex trigger?
Yes, that's what I was referring to, Apex trigger. Yeah.
Awesome. Another question from Tamara. Is the location of parentheses important for SF queries? Asking because it matters in Razor's itch.
So if we're talking about queries like in Apex, so ISOQL, yes, the parentheses matter when you're trying to do a grouping, but for the purpose of flows, you don't really need to worry about that because you don't have to write the query yourself. You just have to use the get element, specify the conditions. That's it. That's all. You don't have to specify the query and write it yourself, nor to put parentheses anywhere.
Right. Another question is, could you please give another use case for before save trigger?
Yeah, so basically before save trigger, as I mentioned, is it's the go-to option if you want to update fields or values on the triggering record. So really you can think about like any automation that you would want to do on any object, like a case. Let's say you want to update values on a case based on conditions. So I don't know, let's say when a case is closed, you want to update a field on the case. That would be a before save. Again, an opportunity, when an opportunity hits a certain stage and you want to update a field or hits a specific amount, you want to update a specific field on the opportunity, that is the before save. But remember that there are some limits. So if you want to do things outside of the record that triggered the flow, so you want to create a task, update the account, then you cannot use anymore a before save flow.
Next question from Mohammed. Is the scheduled path practically a replacement towards batch Apex?
I wouldn't say that. So there is another type of flow that we won't cover in that series because it's a bit more advanced. It's called schedule triggered flow, which I think would be closer to what we can use in batch Apex, because schedule triggered flow are basically flow that can auto launch based on specific conditions. So I think that is closer to batch.
But it's less flexible though. It's the schedule flow will be less flexible than a batch trigger where you can very well control like every let's say I want to send one unit at a time in my flow, for example, or stuff like this. So it will maybe in the future release it will be a replacement, but right now you're still more you have more flexibility with the batch Apex.
Yeah, that's true. There are still some limits with Flow. They're getting there, but yeah, if you want to do a comparison, that's the comparison you do. Basically, schedule pass and async, you need to think about it as kind of the asynchronous way for Flow. So the comparison would be with anything that is future, anything that is like queued Apex, it can be also batch Apex, but anything that is asynchronous, schedule pass and async path is doing the same thing.
Okay, so it was my comment on this one. I really like to thank you for answering this one. So just one more remarks I really looking for is like, is Salesforce looking to replace Apex at all? I mean, altogether with the flows as well, just like they did with the process builder, or what they are like heading for? And as a Salesforce developer, I'm just starting getting into it. So where do you want me to focus on, right? More on flows, or full flows plus Apex because it's gonna stay there for long?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can give you my perspective, and Olivier, I don't know if you want to share yours, but
we're not really Salesforce, so
yeah, we're not representing Salesforce, but my point of view on that is that Salesforce is pushing more and more for like the clicks, not code, and trying to make it easier for anyone to do config and empower admins to do a lot of the stuff. I think there are still some limits that Flows will not be able to address. So I think Apex is going to remain there. But I think the go-to solution when you're thinking about implementing something should always be Flow. And you'll see in the last session, we can really make Flow work together pretty well with Apex as well, because from a Flow, you can call Apex just by dragging and dropping an element. So it makes it easier as well to, even though you're using a mix of like flows plus custom code, it makes it easier to understand and visualize what's happening, even for an admin. So I'd say keep studying, like keep learning about Apex, but definitely learn about flows, because that should be your go-to solution when you when you think about implementing something or extending something on the platform.
All right, got it.
Awesome. Thank you, Mohammed. Right. And the last question is how many from Shivani, how many scheduled or async path can we add on a single flow?
That's a great question. I don't have the answer. Olivier, do you have it?
I don't have either, but we can send it next session we can have the answer for you, because
we don't know.
Perfect. All right. So yeah, thank you so much for answering those questions, William and Olivier. Prashant is here to give a closing statement, and for the most awaiting part of the session, the giveaway for the travel for the voucher. Go ahead, Prashant.
Thank you, Neil, and then again, huge thanks, William and Olivier. This is incredible, very useful, and I mean, and again, thank you for everyone who joined and the incredible participation. So I will not. I'll quickly share my screen. I will not wait further. So what we've done is we've pulled sort of everyone's name from the registration list who's on the call, and we have their names. So as you can see, we've got a pretty crowded group here. Of course, what I'll do is I'll share the details. I mean, once we get the winner, we're looking for the first name, last name, and the email address associated with the WebSS ID. You can email the details to us. Of course, you have to be on the call to win. So if the person's not there, we will just continue spinning. So here we go. Let's see who our first winner is. Okay, Kavya Murugesan, are you on the call? Is Kavya on the call?
Yes.
Hey, congratulations, Kavya.
Yay,
So wonderful. You'll get a certification voucher from Salesforce. We'll just ping you what all details we require for you to be able to claim that. But congratulations, you are our first winner today. Awesome. Now let's see who our next winner is. Anisha Dasgupta. Anisha, are you on the call?
Yes, I am.
Awesome. Well, both of you, thank you so much for staying till the end, and congratulations, Anisha, as well.
Thank you.
We'll reach out to you for the details for the certification voucher. Again, thank you everyone for joining and being part of the session. I know this is incredibly exciting, and we've got 2 more sessions to go. I'm sure we'll have more representation, and we'll have more countries also covered in the future sessions. So William and Olivier, once more, a huge thank you, and for everyone who's on the call, thank you so much for being part of the session. Appreciate it.
Thank you,
Yeah,
guys.
Ravan.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.